Takes a few minutes for people to come in anyway.
Okay, I just want to tell Delaney that if she gets here, she can come out. She's my law student.
Should we bring out chairs like in advance?
That's okay. If she comes, she can just grab one.
Jen, just keep you posted if you can on if the next thing's happening on timing.
Okay.
Making up a road trip on the fly.
Oh, nice. Okay,
Yeah.
that's how I do.
We're obviously in Philadelphia, going to Cleveland next.
Oh, great.
West Virginia. We're good?
Wow.
Cool. Hello. Jordan Sheridan, still live in Philadelphia. They call it the city of brotherly love, but I think we need to evaluate how much love is going on here. Going to give it a couple minutes for people to come in, just to rewind before we get to the great guest we're going to speak to. Yesterday, we were in Philadelphia, first day, and we went to McPherson Square, which is in Kensington. And I mean, just to be honest, Kensington is an extremely poor area in Philadelphia, not too far away from the very nice gentrified area of Philadelphia. If you know gentrification, it's not just in Philadelphia. And we spoke with an activist here who is part of Club Sandwich, which is a group that hands out food and other things to houseless individuals. And as we were talking to her, an actual person who's been sleeping in the park for over a year came up to us, and we talked to him after, not live, Kazim, who was a construction worker who, like many people, laid off because of the COVID pandemic and got evicted from his home and was sleeping in that park, is sleeping in that park for over a year, under trains, in the park, through the cold, through the hot, and sleeping in a park full of houseless individuals, many of whom became houseless during the pandemic, despite hundreds of millions of dollars coming to places like Philadelphia and elsewhere. For some reason, that money has not been distributed to everybody. And that's for the houseless. It's also for people that are housed and are currently facing eviction. So a lot going on in Philadelphia tomorrow and the rest of the week, potentially more evictions of houseless people by the police here. They call them sweeps out of specific locations that all their stuff is in. They have nowhere else to go. So we're going to talk about those things. So I wanted to introduce Professor Stephanie Senna. You're with Villanova University. And how long have you lived in Philadelphia? And kind of tell a little bit of your background, how you kind of got involved in, fighting, you and your colleagues, for houseless individuals.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and thank you for raising awareness about this really important issue. I have been living in Philadelphia. Well, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. There was a period of time where I was in the suburbs a long time ago, but have been back for about a decade now, living in the city, and have traveled, but have always come back to home, and this is my home. Yeah.
And can you kind of talk about, you were born and raised here, left for a little bit, came back. Talk about the evolution of Philadelphia. It's not just Philadelphia, many cities. How was it when you were younger, and how has it evolved in terms of kind of this tale of two cities that we see now? Really nice couple blocks, gentrified areas, and poor areas that have developed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Philadelphia is in many ways similar to a lot of big cities in the country, where we have over the last few decades experienced tremendous gentrification, and we have in this country really a massive wealth divide. So right now our population has the largest gap in wealth since the census started accounting for that over 50 years ago. And so as that gap in wealth gets bigger and bigger and bigger, what you are seeing is this major diversion. You have people who are incredibly wealthy in the cities and who are living in, luxurious mansions. And then you also have more people who are on the streets. So we've always had, to some extent, some level of homelessness. It really picked up throughout the country in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. But homelessness and poverty has increased dramatically over the last decade or so. And what you have is Philadelphia right now is considered to be the poorest big city in the country. We have about 1/4 of our whole population living under the poverty line. So that's about 400,000 people. And you see them, and sometimes you don't see them. So sometimes you see them on the street, but many of them are hidden from view. A lot of people who are homeless are couch surfing or in abandoned buildings or vehicles. And you have a lot of the homeless population today who are the working poor. So that population is growing. And there's really, a lot of people who, as you're covering, are facing eviction. But these stories are usually underrepresented and undertold. I think the public has a misperception that people who are experiencing homelessness are in active addiction. And the truth is that there's actually a small percentage of people experiencing homelessness overall who are what's considered chronically homeless. And these are people who have multiple disabilities or illnesses, sometimes also addiction, and have been homeless for a long time. That's only about 15% of the entire population of people homeless, but they are the public face of homelessness. It's who we see when we go to the parks. The rest of the population we often don't see because they're hidden from our view. They're in shelters or, as I mentioned, couch surfing or, really in abandoned houses, squatting. So I see them, but the public, this is often out of the view of the public's range. And I've seen this increasing. And now, in terms of change over time, what I'm seeing in the encampments is more and more of that population of the working poor who are who at one time had been invisible and now they're on the streets. So it's like every group is getting it seems there's no bottom, and the people who were housing insecure are now just houseless, and the people who are houseless are being arrested. And, so whatever someone's position was, it's getting worse. So we're starting to see the population, and I see this in Kensington. There are people who are chronically homeless, but there are also people living on the streets now who are not, but have nowhere else to go.
Gee, I guess the new normal is kind of the old normal, only worse. Smash the like button, folks. Like button right under the video. Share this live stream. Obviously, YouTube is hiding us like many other independent channels, so we need your help. Like, share, make an original Facebook post, Twitter post. Let people know we're live. Actually, you're reminding me of something I covered a couple years ago when you say working poor, because in Portland, I was covering, the Oregon primary in 2016. And I got in touch with a really big houseless encampment, and they told me, yeah, come, we don't know if people want to talk to you, but you could come look and see. And when I got there, I was like, wait a minute, there's nobody here. There was like 2 people there because they were working. Mm-hmm. The houseless were working. Yes, that's right. So I think a lot of people don't realize that a lot of people cannot, even with the money they're making, cannot afford the apartment rates or, home rates in Philadelphia, in Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, D.C. I could go on and on and on.
So to that point, the average rent in Philadelphia is $1,400 a month, but we still have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, even though the cost of living has increased dramatically, and so has the cost of housing. In fact, in the last year or so, housing costs have gone up about 30%. So I mean, we're in a bubble, but that is a concern. So there's this massive gap between the cost of rent and and wages, and so that's a major problem when you have so many people working multiple low-wage jobs and they can't afford to live in the city where they work. Another major problem, so housing is becoming really a luxury commodity, and that's disturbing. But another trend I'm seeing is that more and more housing today is owned by corporations who are out of state, who are like LLCs, and they're commodities. And so these corporations leave the houses empty on purpose, waiting for the land to appreciate, so then they could flip it and sell it for a profit. So a lot of these houses that are vacant are vacant by design, and that's housing in the marketplace, and that is bizarre when we have so many people dying of homelessness and there's all of these vacant houses. But landlords today, I think that when we think about eviction, we maybe set up this dichotomy between we either feel sympathy for the landlord or for the tenant who is on the verge of being evicted. But I want us to understand that more and more landlords are not the picture we have of this little old couple who owns a couple investment properties and they rent it out. That does happen still, to be sure, but it's happening less and less. And so now there's a dramatic increase in corporations buying up these properties and being the landlord, or what they do is they contract out a landlord service, like a management company, and then they own so many properties and they have so many tenants under them, and if a tenant misses a payment, there's an emergency or something happens and they're not able to pay, or there's COVID and they're out of work, for the landlord, these people are just numbers, right? And so they're not going to try to work with them because there's so many people who need housing. So it's this situation in which a lot of these companies, they have let lawyers on retainer who go to eviction court and evict people every single day of the week. And those people who are evicted find it almost impossible to get housing after they have an eviction on their record. And then in addition to that, you have people who are who can't even get into housing because for every vacant house or every housing application, there's about 10 to 20 people who are applying for that housing. So I've had people who make money, they have a job, they've worked the same job for a long time, they can afford rent, but they don't have a good enough credit. And so because of their credit check, they can't get that housing. That's actually more of a problem, the credit, than actually having a job. And it's not the major factor of whether or not someone can get housing. It's usually if they have poor or no credit, they can't get housing, usually combined with having limited money. And so that's another major problem.
I want to fast forward a little bit to the pandemic because I think that, the narrative in the media was like, oh, great, there's an eviction moratorium. But there was never any public discussion like, well, why is it a moratorium? We print money for war. We print money for subsidies to the banks, the fossil fuel companies, Big Pharma, Silicon Valley. They all get subsidies. We print money for a lot of things. We have the money. People talk about inflation. Well, we have inflation. It's called gentrification. So can you kind of talk about, in Philadelphia, what did the city do at the start for houseless people, for people being evicted? I mean, I'm hearing numbers from other states that cities got hundreds of millions of dollars, but like 4%, 5%, 10% was distributed. Kind of give us the rewind of how it played out here in Philadelphia.
So, yeah, I mean, first of all, the money was not distributed as it should have been. And so there was a surplus at the end when, the CARES money ran out and when all this funded, or when there was a date in which you had to have used the money by. And if you hadn't used it by that date, it had to go elsewhere. So in Philadelphia, and I think Pennsylvania is a state, when the money ran out, we put it in correction facilities. So the money that was to go to renters, but wasn't distributed adequately, there was money left over, and so that just went to prisons. So that's not great. But the other thing that I want to make clear about COVID and evictions is, yes, there was an eviction moratorium. However, this is really important, and I don't think it's discussed nearly enough, but most renters in Philadelphia who are below the poverty line actually live in what's called informal rental situations. So because if you are poor or coming from poverty, or you've been incarcerated before, you have bad credit, and credit itself is not, it is a measure really of privilege and race often. And so if you have bad credit and you can't get a place, what's happening is there's this kind of underground or black market for housing. And so you have landlords who are not licensed to be landlords. And I also could speak forever about how racist the licensing system is. But you have landlords who are not licensed. They don't have rental, like a homeowner's insurance, any kind of thing like this. And then they rent to people. And so they won't do a credit check. And they'll say, okay, I'll rent you this room for $450. And somebody can afford that. And the landlord will say, and this actually is a student who's coming, Delaney, situation, that her landlord didn't do a credit check. So sometimes they'll do that, but it's not an official rental. So sometimes it'll be like a verbal agreement or something. And so all of those unofficial rental agreements, which is actually how most people who are in poverty are living in Philadelphia, they did not fall under the eviction moratorium because they weren't formal rental agreements. So yeah, there's no actual lease. So what ends up happening is none of those people were protected, and most of those people were people below the poverty line. So I think there were people who didn't understand that, and they were like, they heard of people becoming evicted, or somebody would tell them I'm evicted, and the general public who wouldn't know this would think, well, there's an eviction moratorium, you're covered, and not understand that that poor people have been forced into this underground housing system in which they are not protected.
And also for the people that are on leases and actually have protection, I mean, in what world can people pay back $10,000 to $20,000 in back rent like that? You think these same, I call them slumlords, LLCs, private equity? I mean, the story came out that the remaining Koch brother is buying up all these homes and apartments. How do people, when the moratorium's up, pay back? How, could be a couple thousand, could be 10,000, could be more in rent. I mean, it's just crazy. But I don't know, the media just kind of glosses over it. It's not even being talked about right now that the moratorium's up. And frankly, even though there is a moratorium, I mean, I have people reaching out to me that they've already been evicted.
Oh, it's happening all the time. And it's in terms of like, how are people going to pay that back? They're not going to pay that back. And so what we're in is a second Gilded Age, and, and that more and more people are going to be homeless. More and more people are ending up on the streets. There's more encampments everywhere. And housing is something that is going to be out of reach for a lot of people more and more. And when the Koch brothers buy up all the housing, or Blackstone is another equity firm that own, I think they're the biggest landlord in the country, Blackstone. And so, yeah, but I also want to be clear that it's this, and this is important, it's not just these big bad LLCs and corporations. It's also the agencies that are tasked with helping those who are poor, like the housing authorities and the offices of homeless services. So in this country, what we have more and more is this massive divide, and there are so many people and children dying of poverty and hunger. So how as a nation can we go to bed? Like, how can we sleep at night? So what we've done is create these agencies that reassure others that everything's okay, right? And so if you look at the housing authorities, people assume, well, we have this housing authority, so we have public housing. But really, the housing authorities are themselves an engine for gentrification. They're taxpayer funded, so the housing authorities get money from HUD, the federal government agency for housing and urban development, and they get that tax dollar money, and then what they do is they take land away from poor people. So in Philadelphia a couple years ago, the Philadelphia Housing Authority took about 1,200 houses away from poor people in North Philadelphia by eminent domain, and most of those people are still waiting to be compensated. And what's happened to that housing? A lot of it is still vacant about 5 years later. Others of it have been sold to corporations. So what this is reverse welfare. It's yeah, it is. It's money that is coming from all of us. It's our taxpayer money. We think it's going to help people who are poor. In actuality, it's contributing to gentrification, helping the rich just stay rich. And so that's important too, is that I personally, my worldview and my politics is that I believe, first of all, that humans should have a right to housing and water and food. Water, by the way, is also, this year started to be traded as a commodity. And I'm like, oh, great, we are done. Maybe that's good.
I've been to Flint 17 times, so I'm with you.
Yeah. So I think these things are human rights, and I think that we need to fight for a more equitable society. And I think, I believe in a strong government and services. I believe fundamentally that we shouldn't have we shouldn't have billionaires. During the pandemic, the United States added 29 new billionaires and 55 million people became unemployed. So that's a massive problem. And I think, neoliberalism has, in essence, taken these government agencies and made them operate like, in essence, the handmaiden of corporations. So I believe in government. I don't believe that it is working the way that it should. I don't think it's democratic. And I think that we need to alter it and revolution now.
Well, there's another element that I just learned earlier. You have real estate developers that are on your city council.
Yes.
You have, the government is bought federally, on the state level, on the local level. They're all taking money from the banks, the fossil fuckers, big pharma, big real estate, Silicon Valley. But you also have on the Philadelphia City Council real estate developers. It's beyond a conflict of interest.
Yes, you do. So specifically, I think you're referring to Alan Dom. And Alan Dom continues to fight against ending the tax abatement. And so the tax abatement in Philadelphia is that if you are a developer and you build property or you own something that is new building, you don't have to pay taxes for 10 years, for a decade. And meanwhile, we have, the problem with that is that the city, you have so much poverty in the city, and so to let these wealthy, developers off, and homeowners do get it because usually developers will pass that off to a homeowner. So if a developer, builds a house and sells it, the homeowner doesn't have to pay taxes for a decade on that property. So we have that. You also have places like Penn. So Penn owns 10% of the whole city of Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, and they are considered a nonprofit, and so they are tax exempt. And so owning 10% of the whole city of Philadelphia and not paying taxes, that tax money is so vital, especially when it comes to schools. So Pennsylvania is considered to be one of the 10 worst states when it comes to funding education. And so we're also we have one of the most regressive tax systems where the poor pay the highest tax rate in this state than in most states. And so, but in terms of the way education is funded here, the state only pays a sliver of the funding for schools, and so I think it's like 34th out of, I don't know, I don't remember what place it's in, but Philadelphia's in Pennsylvania's in a very bad place here comparatively to all the states. So the state, the way public schools are funded, they get funding from the federal government, the state government, and then the local taxes. And so federal government kicks in like nothing. I mean, we're talking maybe 50 billion compared to, 800 billion for military that they spend on the military. States kick in whatever they do, but Pennsylvania kicks in the least amount. I think for Pennsylvania, it's about 30% that they kick in for school funding. And so what that ends up happening is that since the federal government kicks in almost nothing, it's all dependent on the local tax base. So we also have in the state of Pennsylvania some of the wealthiest schools and the poorest schools, where the difference in pupil is $14,000. So a student in a public school, a wealthy public school in Pennsylvania, they have $14,000 more a year invested in them than a kid in Philadelphia. So if then the schools are only funded, or basically mostly funded, by the local tax base, and in Philadelphia there is no tax base because there's abatements for everybody. There's Penn that doesn't pay its taxes and owns 10% of the city. There's, and then you have in Kensington all of these vacant lots and factories and warehouses that are owned by corporations and people from out of state. They're back. They don't pay taxes. They should, but they're back. They're behind in taxes, and the city doesn't go after them. And they owe millions of dollars to the city. Just in the neighborhood of Kensington, landlords or owners who are not in state and are not paying their taxes owe millions. So I talked to someone at the encampment yesterday, and they said, "Why do the cops come after us? Why do the authorities want us? Why don't you go after the owners in Kensington who are not paying their taxes that they should be?" And he made a valid point. And to me, that is where that's the problem. Like, that's the problem. We need to hold them accountable and have a tax rate that was more, in my mind, democratic. Like under the Eisenhower administration, a Republican administration, it was the last time we've taxed the rich that high. And usually in a pandemic, like the one we've had right now, the one we're having, like COVID, or a war, what ends up happening is that the wealthiest take a hit for the good of all. This is the first time where the wealthiest have instead gotten richer.
Unless you're George W. Bush, who gave 2 tax cuts to the wealthy while sending us to war on false pretenses. I wanted to point out, what you're describing as a corrupt cesspool. Sorry, city of brotherly love. It's not just you. It's also corporate socialism, because the wealth is being redistributed, and poor people and working class people and the working poor are paying most of the taxes, while these corporate grifters enjoy their yachts and tax breaks. I mean, somebody's paying when they're not, and that would be socialism.
Absolutely, that is exactly what it is. So when people throw around these ideas, like, the Trump supporters who didn't want Biden, and they were like, oh, we're going to become socialist. I was like, oh my God. And some of this is, I don't know, when I'm looking at, like, how do you fix this, or how what is the context of this? How does it start? For me, I think a huge part is education. And so, like, when people want to know what is the cause of poverty, first of all, or what is poverty, I always tell them, this is so important, poverty is a robbery, and there are people who are profiting off of it. And poverty journalism needs to be investigative. Most poverty journalism, what it is poverty voyeurism. It's going and looking at the poor and saying, look how the poor live, that's so sad, right? And that's not good journalism. I think poverty journalism is investigating, why is the Philadelphia Housing Authority taking housing away from the poor? Come in, Delaney, come on. my student. Why are they taking my, this is Delaney Keefe. Hi. We're on live, so you're going to keep, I'm going to keep talking, but then but so sit.
Okay.
Oh, you can definitely bring a chair or sit, you know, I know. Okay. So I say, you know, I was just saying my thing about poverty is a robbery. Yep. Somebody is profiting, and journalism should uncover who is profiting, why, and is this, and we should ask the question: is this the system we want? So I think that one of the ways that I think you fix this or you solve this has to be from education, and it's not. It's, you know, I think when people think, oh, we have poverty because we have an underfunded education system. Yes, we do. We have an underfunded education system and an unequal funding of education. And that's important. It keeps people in poverty, it exacerbates this gap in wealth. However, I indict the whole education system, including mine. I grew up in Council Rock and went to one of the richest public schools in Pennsylvania. And I wasn't taught shit. I don't know if I can curse on you. Okay. So, you know, I was taught basically that the civil rights movement happened, and thank God for Martin Luther King, and we're all good now, right? And never ever did when we were learning about integration and segregation, did my teacher ever ask us to look around at our class and ask the question is, why is it so white, right? And so there was never any connection made between our world and what we were studying, and we just learned lies. And so I think that we have to re-educate our public, and that's in the schools. It's also with the press, though. Like, there is a job that the press has, and I think that so many people are asleep at the wheel. So I'm grateful for you and the work that you do, because this is what we need for for society to advance. I think is the public to be made aware. Awareness itself is I think vital, but you can't stop there. So I think we all have a part to play in the revolution, and I play many parts. And so, but I'm also a fan of like no leaders. That we all have a role to play, and at times I'm playing a role that is central, and at other times I'm napping. But I hope it's okay if I introduce Delaney. Yeah, so this is my student, Delaney Keefe. So I am, again, I teach in the law school at Villanova. I'm the anti-poverty fellow at the Charles Widger School of Law at Villanova. But I'm actually not a lawyer. I'm a historian. I don't know how I got this position, but anyway, well, I've been teaching at Villanova for 20 years. But Delaney, I started a year ago, and early on when I started, one of my colleagues said, you should meet Delaney Keefe. And so Delaney and I met down at the Parkway encampments, and I am a big fan of I teach about white savior complex and how not to do advocacy. I think that people are with good intentions are messing it up all the time. And so I in my classes at Villanova, which is very white and very privileged, we start all classes on like a unit on white privilege and why you can't just go into a community that's not your own and think you're some hero, savior.
Sure, the culture warriors are a big fan of you.
Oh gosh, please. I'm on all kinds of hit lists.
Why you're working at Villanova Law School, honestly, because you're the only person there that is going to say those types of things. You're a valuable asset.
Thank you, Delaney.
The best professor.
Not sure that everyone sees it that way, but so Delaney and I met, and what I'm talking about the white savior complex is that we did not go into the encampment, saying like we're going to sue. Basically, people came to us and said, can you help us find lawyers for litigation to stop the evictions and the sweeps? And Delaney and I originally last summer tried so hard to get lawyers to take this case. We called the ACLU and all kinds of firms. But no one would take our case, and I put it out on Facebook, and I said, can anybody help us? We need a lawyer, because I'm not a lawyer. Delaney's a student. We need a supervising attorney with a bar in Pennsylvania, who's barred in Pennsylvania. And my friend Mike Huff responded, I'll do it. And he's a criminal defense lawyer. And we took it on, the three of us, and now we're taking it on again. When I say we, though, I want to be very careful to explain that Delaney wrote the entire brief. And so Delaney has put in so much time and energy and work into this and had so many sleepless nights. And I'm incredibly proud of her. She's movement lawyering. I think a lot of lawyers and law students are really kind of holding up a corrupt system. They're allowing these systems of inequity to continue. And that is not Delaney. Delaney is using her education, her power, her voice to really fight against these systems of inequity and create something better. So Delaney, I'm so proud of her. I'm happy to like change this if you want to like put her here.
We could get her in the shot. So let me ask you, are you freshman, junior? So
I just finished my second year of law school, so there's 3 years. Yeah, so but when we first met, I had just finished my first year of law school. Yeah, and we met, like you were saying, at the encampments last summer. I got involved with the encampments last summer, like in maybe early June. When they first started out, I was like, helping people put tarps over their tents for the rain, and I was starting to try and help people get connected to legal services, free legal services in Philadelphia, but mostly I was cooking and serving food and working at the donations table and, doing tarps and just kind of building a community. And then Stephanie approached me and told me, I basically thought that there was nothing to be done about these notices. I knew that it was unjust, but I had just finished my first year in law school. I had no idea how to do anything, really. I was working in consumer bankruptcy at the time, so I could help people with that. But yeah, we called probably 35, 40 different law firms and lawyers in Philadelphia, and they all told us that either they're working for the city, most of them are working for the city, which makes me think that the city keeps the majority of law firms here on their payroll to prevent people from being able to sue them.
That's not corrupt.
Yeah, that's not corrupt at all, right? The city needs 40 law firms. But
Itself a problem.
yeah. Or that it was the risk reward wasn't good enough. People were telling us that, they're going to put in a lot of time for something that is largely unsuccessful, and that's true. It's true that these eviction injunctions for homeless people across the United States are not often successful. We've had small successes that have led to slightly larger successes across the country, and so we continue to do it. Stephanie's probably talked about this already. I missed the first half of this, but we continue to do it, first of all, because the more case law you can build up, the more tiny wins that you can build, the better chance you'll have of a big win 10 years from now, 5 years from now, whatever. But also because of the value of people being able to be heard, taking affidavits, making sure that people can go into federal court and get up on the stand and say, all my stuff has been taken from me every single day for years, and the police are abusing me and the city is abusing me. And I think that is just as valuable as the potential for actually winning. I went on a tangent there. I don't know if you had any questions. I was just talking about how we met first.
Oh, that's okay. By the way, a reminder, smash that like button right under the video. Like. Share this live stream. Go to statuscoup.com/theotherpandemic. Statuscoup.com/theotherpandemic. Support us if you can. It's not cheap to do actual journalism. I'll add, by the way, on education. Obviously, the Israel's occupation of Palestine has been covered. In schools, we don't quite teach America's occupation of Native Americans accurately either. But that's a tangent. So I want to dig more into the actual lawsuit. But first, I want to point out what you're describing, that you were there in the summer, helping people put up their tarps, helping in whatever way you can. Let's remember, it was a raging pandemic going on in this country. Obviously, it was worse in the weather, but the summer was still very bad. So the states and cities were not doing enough or next to nothing for the houseless. But The whole thing is social distancing, but they're cramped in these, parks, camps, some people sleeping under trains. I spoke with somebody yesterday that was describing in the winter, which was 200,000 cases. This was before vaccines were distributed. You had people bundling for body warmth during a pandemic. So houselessness is a public health risk anyway. But during the pandemic, these people were forced to risk their health because the city wouldn't adequately help them.
Yeah. So actually, it's interesting you should say that because in October, prior to the pandemic, so if we started, getting panicky in March, so this is a few months earlier, I used to host a podcast, and I had one of my dear friends and former students, Delaney, on my podcast interviewed. He was the head of the nurses union for Hahnemann Hospital. Hahnemann Hospital was one of the city's biggest hospitals and one of our most important teaching hospitals that was closed down in 2019. And the owner declared bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the owner is like a billionaire himself. And so this hospital closed, and the vast majority of people who were below the poverty line were patients at this hospital and now had nowhere to go. And when I was talking to Dylan about the ramifications of one of our major hospitals closing, and we have now no public hospitals in the whole city of Philadelphia, I said, if we get a pandemic, we're fucked. Because, that's the thing is that, I think it's easy not to care about other people, but this system is really a snake eating its own tail, because that sickness is going to come back to us if we don't have a hospital and people who are sick and poor can't get treatment. They're going to spread sickness everywhere. It's going to be harder to contain it, and it's going to affect the entire population. We are going to have more of a strain on our hospitals if we have a pandemic, and that's exactly what happened. And there were so many deaths in the city of Philadelphia that could have been prevented. And one thing that really made me so angry is that Brian Abernathy, who was at the time the acting whatever deputy of the city, I don't even know what his job was, but he had the opportunity to take over Hahnemann by eminent domain. It was privately owned and it was vacant all during the pandemic, and he didn't take advantage of that. But at the same time, the city is constantly taking houses by eminent domain all the time and leaving them absolutely vacant. If that hospital had been open or reopened during COVID, we could have saved so many lives. The other thing I want to mention, though, that is important is that you said, the people who are out on the streets are in close quarters. I actually believe that it's significantly safer for people who are experiencing homelessness to be outside in tents than to be in congregate settings like shelters. And actually, that's why the CDC has come out to say cities should not sweep their encampments. It's safer outside. We had very few cases of COVID in the encampments. We had a medic on site 24/7 who was doing regular COVID testing. And we had a case of COVID where the person was able to go in their tent and quarantine. We didn't have a spread. However, when the encampment was disbanded and some people did go into shelters or were forced into shelters, COVID did spread rampantly throughout the shelters. So, I think that COVID does disproportionately affect people who are in poverty and people of color. But in general, encampments are safer than the shelter system.
Yeah. Can I speak on that for a second, too? That was a big argument that we made in the case last summer, mostly because at a certain point at our brother's place, a men's shelter in Philadelphia, was the only one that was really tracking their COVID cases. A lot of other shelters just weren't providing information, but our brother's place provided information about COVID, and 50% of the staff and residents of our brother's place, Philadelphia, had COVID. The shelters were rampant with COVID, and I obviously through the course of preparing litigation, I talked to a lot of people, and you see people who we had a mother and her infant child put in a room with somebody with COVID symptoms by themselves in close quarters, less than 6 feet apart with no masks. We had shelters that didn't have running water. We had shelters that didn't have soap. And one of the city's great complaints about the encampments last summer were that some residents had opened up a water fountain to create a hand washing station and at the encampments and to create a mobile shower. And we also were renting porta potties and things like that so that we could have, a somewhat sanitary environment. And the city at a certain point canceled our porta potty rentals. They basically threatened the company with litigation if they don't stop renting to us. So they stopped renting to us temporarily. And
on what basis did the city do that?
Basically that they were supporting illegal activity, or at least it's complicated about whether it's illegal to encamp or not, right? There's a case called Martin v. Boise, which says basically that criminalizing sleeping on the streets is cruel and unusual punishment, is a violation of the 8th Amendment. However, cities love to not criminalize it in the way that you would go to jail, but continue to harass and take the property of people who live out there under the guise of the Philadelphia Code. They love to cite people with camping violations or vagrancy violations or, public nuisance, loitering, anything that is not criminal you're still allowed to cite people with and punish people for. You just can't criminalize homelessness under Martin v. Boise. You can't send them to jail, but you can take everything that they have. And so they were threatened, to get back to the question, the porta potty companies were threatened with violations of the code vicariously because they were assisting people in violating camping ordinances. And
so you could terrorize them but not criminalize it.
You can't send them to jail, but you can take everything that they have.
And the city was saying that they were very concerned about the health of the people down in the Parkway, but if you're concerned about the health of the people and you're taking away their hand washing station and their porta potties, it doesn't sound very,
Right, and sending them to shelters. You're worried about people's safety when they're in tents that are 6 feet apart from each other outside in the open air. But your solution to that is to send them to places where the beds are pushed up against each other and people are sleeping with their faces next to each other, and there's a 50% COVID rate. It is not even to speak of, the physical danger and the theft and the fraud and the corruption that happens in the shelter system. Just the COVID precautions were not being taken. And we've been working with a nurse practitioner that was working at the COVID hotels as well. And she said that she had to fight to get people even individually sectioned off space. They were originally going to put 70 people in a space that was designed for 30. They're packing people in. And that's also because I don't know if the city actually follows, encampment-related cases across the country, but there have been some cases recently that have basically said that it is inhumane to conduct encampment sweeps when there are more homeless people on the streets than there are available shelter beds. Basically, if there's nowhere else for them to go, you have to leave them alone. So I think that the city packs people in like cattle in order to avoid this problem, in order to avoid the problem of, we can't harass them anymore if we don't have enough shelter beds. Yeah. So we're going to put people in inhumane conditions. We're going to make them sleep in chairs. We're going to make them sleep 2 inches away from everybody else in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah. And this is why I believe the shelters are run by the Office of Homeless Services, and like HUD or the housing authorities, I believe that the Office of Homeless Services, it's a great name. If you just heard this name, you would think, oh, great, that city has an office that helps the homeless.
What did it used to be called?
Oh, something with the word housing. Yeah.
The Office of Supportive Housing.
Yeah, that's right. Now they just don't even.
They changed the name in 2018 or something like that. And a lot of people think they changed the name to Office of Homeless Services because they weren't providing housing. Yeah. Because as of 2013, the housing list had been closed. Yeah. Nobody was getting housing, so they had to be the Office of Homeless Services instead.
But in general, they're not helping people experiencing homelessness. They exist, I think, to quell the anxiety variety of the housed in Philadelphia who are experiencing, frustration over the homelessness that they see. And so the Office of Homeless Services is there to make it look pretty. But it's not pretty, it's ugly. And I think that we need to do a deep dive into this ugliness to really reckon with it. And there's a lot of things we can do to reckon it. I was saying before that I think everyone has their place in this fight. And it doesn't, I don't think that it matters your skill set or your, degree or level of education. So again, I want to be clear, I am not a lawyer. I know how to do research. And so one of the things that we did, one of the first things we did last summer is we said, okay, we're going to protect this encampment. Has anybody ever done this before? And we Googled and tried to look for other cases throughout the United States where lawyers have taken on, encampment evictions. And we found that the National Homelessness Law Center has done this. We got in touch with their lawyers and they helped us prepare for our case. And then we got in touch with a network of people throughout the country. So it's important always to place our activism in a larger context. Right. And so there, as Delaney was saying, and this is important, that there are cases like this happening all over, and we're building off of each other, and we're talking to each other and learning best practices. And the hope is that we'll keep chipping away at it. And what we want is housing as a human right? And we want decriminalization of homelessness and stop harassing them, and also bring to light what is people are experiencing who are so vulnerable. And it's going to become more and more of us as there seems to be the economic floor is dropping out from under us. So I think that that's important. But there's this attack, this fight. I believe that there are several fronts we have to fight on. One is in the, legal battles, but there's also a fight in the press. We have to raise awareness. So the press plays a role, and all kinds of journalism plays a role. And then also the streets. I think that we need to take to the streets. We need to protest. We need to use our bodies to protect people, and stand there and make sure the cops don't harass. I was at the encampment yesterday when I pulled up to the encampment. There were two huge cop trucks parked at the encampment, and they were just standing there. And I got out of the car and I talked to my friends at the encampment, and I said, what are they doing? And my friend said, they've been here all day harassing us, taking our things. And I went over to one of the cop cars, and I was very polite, but I said, what are you doing? And he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm suing the city because the police are harassing the people down here. And I said, you might not know this, but what you're doing is illegal. And I said, and it's a violation of people's civil rights, and we're taking it to court. And then I said, can I have your name? And he drove away. And then his friend in the other truck drove away. And here's the thing is that they'll come back. We need bodies there, because what this system depends on is that the rest of us don't give a shit. They're depending on us not being there and doing that. And the truth is, only 7% of all lawyers go into public interest and work for people who are on the margins. At Villanova University, the law school, 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 2020, of the whole graduating class, only 2 Villanova students went to work for public interest. Only 2, yes, only 2. And that's awful. That's clearly awful, but there's a context that it does make sense. It does make sense in relation to Villanova. However, nationally, this is also happening. And part of that is that there are students graduating from Villanova with $200,000 of debt. Yeah. And so that's part of it. That first of all, so if you're a black graduating law student, you are graduating with $200,000 of debt. If you are a white graduating law student, you're graduating with $100,000 worth of debt on average. Now, public interest lawyering pays about $70,000 a year, which you can make without a law degree. And that doesn't pay for rent in Philadelphia, right? So if you have $200,000 or $150,000 you have to pay off in loans, you cannot take a $70,000 paid job. So most of these lawyers are going to work in corporate law firms or work for the fucking city, right? Or they go defending corrupt politicians or something. And then what happens on the other end is 85% 50% of people below the poverty line in the United States cannot access a lawyer to represent them. And I'm not talking about just representing them in these cases like encampment evictions, but representing them if they need to get food stamps, if they need, protection from eviction.
They get hit by a car.
If they get hit by a car.
Hit by a dog, attacked.
Workmen's, disability insurance, anything like that.
One of the biggest issues we have too is abuse and violence in the shelter system and theft and fraud by staff in the shelter system, and there's no lawyers that are doing that work, and so they file a complaint. What happens usually is they file a complaint with the shelter, and either nothing happens or they're barred from the shelter system for filing a complaint, basically. And usually they say something like, oh, it's not because you filed a complaint, it's because you take too long in the shower, or it's because you said the F word somewhere sometime, or something. Like, they make some type of excuse, but it happens immediately after you file a complaint. One of the plaintiffs in our case, Thomas Cummins, he and his friend filed a complaint because their welfare and benefits were being stolen from them by shelter staff at Navigation Center. And the person that was stealing from them was fired, and on the same day that they were fired, both of them were kicked out of the shelter system, the entire shelter system. And they can't come back. So do you know what he does? His wife lives in Navigation Center, Cynthia. He lives right across the street from Navigation Center in a tent on the street.
On Kensington.
On Kensington.
The city is trying to sweep him. Yeah. I also want to be clear, especially if we're looking at historical context, and you ask, like, how have things changed over time? When I'm telling you that average people are graduating from law school with about $100,000 to $200,000 in debt, only a couple decades ago, law school was like $5,000 a year, even Harvard Law, and so that is very, very important for me. Our most liberal Supreme Court, the Warren Court, you had all of these judges on the Warren Court who themselves came from poverty, and they attended Harvard Law in order to move up to the Supreme Court. And I was thinking, like, how did these poor kids who grew up in these poor families afford Harvard Law? And that's when I realized that Harvard Law was basically free.
Yep.
And and people were able to move up more. There was more mobility than there is now.
Harvard Law still is free for people whose family went to Harvard Law a lot of the time. One of my friends, Kevin, he didn't go to Harvard Law because his parents, he's trans and his parents were not supportive, but his dad is a Harvard Law professor and he could have gone for free. Anybody who works at Harvard, they can get people in for free, Yeah.
Well, yes. What is that called? Legacy.
Yeah.
That's, but which is the opposite of merit. So, in essence, though, there was a time when lawyers could go to law school and do this thing for free. That time has passed, and now only people with privilege really can make it through law school. And what that means then is, first of all, most of our judges are coming from privilege and wealth and are white. Most of our lawyers are as well, and we have very few lawyers who are going to defend those in poverty, and few lawyers who are going to fight for better case law. And so this is all part of the problem, and it's a problem I see that if you back up and look at it, I'm giving like a lot of statistics and facts, but if you like kind of pan out, what you see is a country that is becoming less and less free, less and less, humane, I think, and it's not a country that I want to raise my children in. And so I am pleading with people to get involved, to do something, whether it is taking on a case, even if you are not a lawyer, and then begging a lawyer who, like Mike Huff, who's going to work pro bono to take this because he just believes in it and is a revolutionary like us, or like I said, you take to the streets, you protest, you give your body, you lend yourself, you go down to where people are, and you say, what can I do for you? And you make friends with people, build trust. That is key too. And then too, like I said, share your story, write it, do journalism, press, get the story out there, help raise awareness. I think those are, to me, like three main fronts where we can fight this.
Well, I wanted to point out, you were mentioning, judges come from privilege and wealth, lawyers. How about the journalists in the local media and the national media? Because I'm not tooting my own horn, but hell if I see many other outlets like in the trenches, speaking with houseless people, speaking with people facing evictions. I mean, hell, CNN right now, it's like the fucking Super Bowl. Biden meeting with Putin. That's all they're talking about. MSNBC. It's hysteria. But millions of people are facing eviction. It's kind of it's not being covered really on a national level. Local media. I've worked in local media. I've been to Flint many times. They literally need to depend on independent media from out of state to come because the Michigan media stopped covering the water crisis. I'm sure it's not rosy here in Philadelphia either. So education is important, but the role of the media is so important here too because, frankly, a lot of journalists go in with the right motivations but are then neutered by their editors and the corporations that own these media companies.
That's exactly right.
We're lucky to have Unicorn Riot. That's my opinion. I am a huge Unicorn Riot fan, and it's because they're one of the only independent news sources that have actually been there on the ground. Last year, this year, they were there they're all across the country, and the value of just being there and making connections. Like last year, we had Unicorn Riot with us like almost every day leading up to the evictions, and they were there afterwards. And at a certain point, all other media outlets had been kind of kicked out of the actual internal encampments because obviously it's a violation of privacy. People are living there. They're, people filming inside of their homes and things like that. But Unicorn Riot was always there, and I think that and I love y'all, and I just support anybody that is willing to put in the time to make connections on the ground, because I think a lot of other media outlets, they show up, they do a story, and then they disappear for 6 months and they're not friends with. And I think that's honestly, and I think you're an amazing spokesperson and a perfect person to be talking about these issues. And I think people reach out to you specifically, and not the people that are living on the streets, not the people that are direct, organizers on the ground and things like that. Media doesn't reach out to me which maybe they shouldn't, but I just think it's because people don't make connections. They pick somebody who's reputable, who they think will be a good source. They pick a Villanova professor and they talk to them, and that's it. Yeah. And it's destructive.
Absolutely.
Generally destructive.
Absolutely.
I'll also point out, we were in the park. We had a freelancer, Jason Peters, who was covering. Yeah, he was live for us. I do like Unicorn Riot, though.
I didn't know Jason Peters.
Yeah. He was with us. Also, forgot to mention, Jen over there was at Hahnemann Hospital covering the protests. So a lot of people,
Exactly what you have to be doing.
because I don't want to get into a tangent. I don't know if you're aware, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter hide independent media and are throttling us. So this is another big thing. They're pumping CNN in your feeds.
Algorithm problem.
Yes. So if you look at trending on YouTube or whatever, it's all like CNBC, Washington Post, CNN. It's all corporate channels. CNN, Wolf Blitzer used to get a few thousand on YouTube. Now they're getting hundreds of thousands. Did people suddenly fall in love with Wolf Blitzer? No, that's all that's in their feed. And the YouTube CEO, YouTube owned by Google, so it's Google. YouTube CEO just openly said that smaller channels, newer channels will be less visible. That's something called YouTube, which was supposed to be anybody can make it. So that's a big problem. But I wanted to drill into the actual lawsuit because, I always think about Erin Brockovich, for example. Totally different. She took on the fossil fuckers, as I call them. But, I think she went into it thinking there was no chance. I've spoken with her before. I think she went in just kind of for the cause. And the preponderance of evidence she got was overwhelming. Obviously, totally, organizers, activists, whether it's professors, students. Obviously, it's a David Goliath situation, but it sounds to me like you have firm legal ground on your side. So can you kind of talk about the obstacles that are...
And then I will come back. I have a lot to say.
Okay. Kind of talk about the obstacles that you're facing, and where did you file the lawsuit? Who specifically is it against? What relief are you requesting? Kind of the meat of the lawsuit.
Sure, absolutely. So we're filing this, and we did file today in federal court because we're claiming violations of civil rights, and so that's something you would file in federal court. And so basically, there's a few things that we're arguing. First is that the city is not following its own protocol. So the city does have protocol for how to sweep an encampment, which includes putting up notices with certain length of time in between. Like we're going to evict on this this day, and it has to give clear boundaries for where they're going to evict. You don't evict an entire neighborhood of Kensington, but in addition to that, the problem is that when people are having their belongings taken and thrown out, that's also in violation of the city's own purported kind of protocol, which is that they store property. They don't throw things away, but to throw them away and damage them is a violation of their property rights. It's also
theft.
It is theft. It is theft. It's cruel and unusual punishment. And, you know, it's really, it's also case law has determined that if the city doesn't have an alternative for where people can go, you cannot sweep somebody or criminalize them for living, for doing things that they have to do to survive. And so if they're encamping, if they're setting up a tent because this is how they survive, and you have given them no alternative survival, then you cannot criminalize them for what they're doing and take away that, you know, that right. So so that's the case. Basically, we have, I think, a lot in our favor. I think we have a much stronger case than we did last year. In addition to what we have this year that we didn't have last year, one thing that you know isn't really about the case, but maybe we can start to talk about it in the public, is that the federal government this year did its first ever study of the effectiveness of sweeps and the cost of sweeps. And what they're finding is that cities throughout the country are conducting these sweeps every year and spending millions of dollars on them, but they are not effective in terms of, you know, people just go from one block to another block. So it's a waste of money.
I love that the federal government's main focus is whether it's efficient financially rather than its moral.
Oh, God. Oh, absolutely.
And even in the legal system, the focus is on financial situation and also property.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm sorry that I just missed what you said, but if we were talking about grounds, the legal grounds that have been most successful in stopping homeless encampment sweeps and, you know, getting reforms for homeless people are 4th and 14th Amendment grounds, which basically 4th Amendment grounds are unreasonable search and seizure, and 14th Amendment grounds are violations of due process, and both of those have to do with property. They are not. The legal system is not invested in the quality of life of people. They are not invested in harassment. They're not invested in abuse. What they are invested in is deprivations of property, which are a violation of the Constitution. So all of our argument has to be centered around, even though that's, you know, only a fraction of what's actually happening, 90% of our argument has to be centered around people's property is being taken and thrown in the trash every single day, and especially during sweeps. And then you get into this argument of, oh God, the city is going to put them all in marked containers and they're going to store them at an undisclosed location for 30 days, even though this is everything that everyone has. They take, and the city represents that that's what they do with people's stuff, and they've done it maybe twice, I think. But the majority of sweeps, they bring a trash truck, the police come, they take everybody's stuff, and they throw it in the trash, and everybody has to start over every single day. So that's the majority of the grounds are on property rights grounds. And and we were going to make other arguments as well that are not as easy to win, that we have decided to save for a more substantive lawsuit in the future, such as like a common law state created danger ground, for example, which basically argues that the affected population would have been better off if the city had just left them alone. By acting, the state has put people in more danger than it would be if they had just left them alone. And so by that we would be talking about, you know, police harassment. We would be talking about forcing people into shelters where they've been abused and assaulted and robbed and, you know, raped. Like, it's horrible, the situations that they're forcing people into, not to mention even just like taking everybody's stuff, putting them in a police car, and then driving them straight, like right outside city limits and dropping them off. You know, the emotional toll that all of these things take on people, I think, is more important, or at least just as important as the property toll. But the only grounds that have ever had any chance of success are Fourth Amendment grounds, search and seizure, 14th Amendment grounds, due process. Basically, you can't deprive people of their property without an opportunity to be heard. Generally, that means in front of a court or another, a body of law, and Eighth Amendment grounds. But since they're only citing Eighth Amendment grounds would be if they were, criminalizing homelessness, if they were actually going out and arresting people.
They've been arrested.
Well, Tom was arrested for staying in an abandoned lot that ended up being private property. Which, you can make an argument that shouldn't have happened either. Yeah. He was staying in an abandoned lot that he didn't know, who it belonged to, whatever. Why is it more dangerous? Why are you allowed to be arrested for sleeping in an abandoned lot, but you're not allowed to be arrested for sleeping 10 feet away from that lot on the sidewalk? It doesn't make any sense. But by using the guise of camping ordinances or, other titles in the code, vagrancy or public nuisance, things like that aren't actually criminal, we can no longer make an Eighth Amendment argument. So we're arguing Fourth and 14th Amendment claims. We were going to do state-created danger. We were going to do an ADA claim as well because the shelters are, I don't know if you've talked about this already, the shelters are completely inaccessible to anybody with mobility problems. There's even shelters that claim to be accessible have massive problems that make them inaccessible. For example, like the elevator being shut down for 6 weeks and people live on the 3rd floor. How are you going to get up there? You're out of the shelter. And even with temporary and permanent housing, individually separated housing, there's like none of that basically for people who have mobility problems because and part of that is the fault of the design of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is not designed to be accommodating to disabilities. There are so few. Last summer I was trying to get somebody in a wheelchair into an apartment. We had money for her, we were trying to find her an apartment, and I went through hundreds of places trying to find a place that didn't have steps going up. We also even had a company that was going to build a ramp for us for free, or it was like a church that was going to build a ramp for free, and landlords didn't want us to do that. They said that it would be an impermissible nuisance on the walking population of that apartment to build a ramp, and yeah, it's Philadelphia is designed to not be accommodating to people with disabilities, and the shelter systems are especially designed to not be accommodating to people with disabilities. So the fact that they say that anything is accommodating to people with mobility problems is a lie. They don't.
The other thing that bothers me is the city will say of people sleeping on the street, they'll call them shelter resistant.
Yeah.
And that phrase kind of gives the message that the people who are shelter resistant are choosing to be on the street, and they've been offered all these services and are refusing to take them. And what is important to understand is that there are people who can't go into the shelter. They're not shelter resistant. They can't go in because of a mobility issue, or they can't go in because they've been blacklisted for speaking out against staff in the shelter, or they refuse to go in, like Cullen, who was raped in a shelter in Philadelphia and assaulted and won't go in, and I don't blame him. If I were raped in a shelter, I wouldn't go back either. Yeah. So this shelter resistant argument is crap. And just housing. Why are we spending millions of dollars to shelter people where it's basically warehousing them in unsafe conditions when we have thousands of vacant houses? And the truth is,
and the city owns them.
The reason why that we've already demonstrated it is much more cost effective to house people, and it is humane to house people. But the reason we don't do it is because it would undermine the current system we have, and the people in power are invested in maintaining the system the way it is. Now, the thing about that is that there are more of us than there are of those people. And so if we combine forces and stop fighting each other, if we can figure that out and combine forces, we could be a force to reckon with. And I think we need to be. I really don't think that there's an alternative. I think that the pandemic showed us that we have no other option. We are running out of time. We're running out of, we're in crisis. In every area, the climate is in crisis. Our mental health is in crisis. Our physical health is in crisis. Our economy is in crisis. And we will either act
You mean it's not roaring back like CNN tells us?
Oh, it's all coming trickle down. It's coming back. Everything. Our economy is booming.
Such a fun
But
trickle.
no, permanent housing is the only option. Permanent housing is the only option because of the egregious conditions in the shelter, because there are not enough shelters, because people shouldn't be in shelters in the first place. And shelters, if you talk to OHS, they'll say that shelters are a temporary fix where people can get connected to services that will eventually lead to permanent housing. That's a lie. Like, people have been in these shelter systems for years. People have been in contact with OHS for 10 years, 15 years, and have not been able to get into any sort of permanent housing or even individually separated temporary housing. It's a lie. And what they want to do is keep people in shelters indefinitely until they run out their stay and then they're kicked out on the street. There's just not adequate protections for people, and there's not a path like they say there is to permanent housing.
I want to bring up another elephant in the outdoor space. The police aren't going in there evicting just because they wake up in the morning and saying, let's go terrorize some houseless people. They have their orders. And, there's a lot of privileged white folk that want the eyesore of houseless people out of their sight. Their children don't have to see it. They don't have to see it. We were talking before we went live. In some ways, in some situations, you could understand hesitation about your children, but in a lot of situations, it's just yuppie white people who don't want to see it, and out of sight, out of mind. Can you kind of talk about that element? Because this week, just so you know, tomorrow specifically, there's expected evictions of a park around here in Kensington, Philadelphia, and there's going to be counter protesters there supporting the evictions. This is people supporting the police tossing these houseless people out of the park.
So first of all, and I'll let Stephanie speak on the actual substantive part of that question, but it's not just that they're trying to evict homeless people from a park in Kensington. The notices state that they are trying to that all homeless people must leave the neighborhood of Kensington, the neighborhood known as Kensington, which first of all has nebulous and argued over boundaries. Where are you supposed to go? Are you supposed to go, to this street? Are you supposed to go 20 blocks away to another? Which one is Kensington? But it's not just an encampment on the park. It's anybody that is sleeping on the streets in Kensington will be moved, and all of their property will be taken from them, and they will be kicked out of the neighborhoods. And so many people that we've talked to, I would even say, to correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of people that we talked to grew up in Kensington. This is their neighborhood. This is their community. And so to say that people who are housed and get to go in their air-conditioned house and look out of their 10th story window and see homeless people on the ground have more rights to be in Kensington than the people that grew up there is heinous, and I'd love for you to talk about the harassment that you have received from these people too. People hate us for doing this stuff. People hate us. These counter protesters are like threatening Stephanie, and saying things like, oh, we're gonna go camp out in Stephanie's yard and see how she feels about that. Stephanie has homeless people staying at her house all the fucking time, and so fucking camp out here. I don't care. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous the lengths that people will go. And you look at what people are saying, and they're saying things like, people in addiction on the streets of Kensington are getting more things than I am, and so that's why I hate them. They're getting free food, and they're getting free shoes, and they're getting blankets, and I've never gotten any of that stuff, and I live in Kensington, so I'm no longer going to help them. This is rewarding addiction. This is pushing people into further addiction, and I disagree. You know what pushes people into further addiction? Taking all their stuff and kicking them out of their communities. We've talked to so many people that were on Suboxone, that were in treatment, and then got swept and fell back into addiction because they lost everything they had, and they continue to lose everything that they have over and over again. And so I don't think you can ever say that giving people housing or giving people food or shoes pushes is enabling addiction. It's enabling being alive. You know, like it's the only way that anybody is ever going to get out of the basic needs mindset of this, you know, being on the streets and being in addiction mindset is to be able to feel comfortable in a space and be able to not be constantly worried that all your stuff is going to be taken from you.
I want to just point out, they don't have heat during the winter. They don't have air conditioning during, I mean, yesterday I was hot, I was going to pass out. So they don't have, you know, the nice things that the people complaining have.
Sitting out in the rain too. We were there in the rain the other day. Everybody's stuff got soaked. They lost so much stuff just being out there in the rain. Because, and another reason why they lose things because of the weather too is the difference in the law between sleeping on the streets unsheltered and creating a tent encampment or having a shelter or, you know, creating any type of like overhang where you can protect your things. It's like I said before, it's an Eighth Amendment violation to criminalize people for sleeping unsheltered on the streets, but it is perfectly legal to harass and intimidate and abuse people for erecting a shelter. When you're sleeping on the streets, you know, all they can do is move you, but once you create a tent, once you create any sort of thing that's going to protect you from the weather, they can get you. It's terrible. It's one of the things that we're trying to eat away at through these continuous lawsuits is the ridiculousness of, well, it's okay to sleep without anything over your head, but as soon as you put something over your head, you're criminalized.
I want to go back to one thing Delaney said, which was important, and that is that the gateway to addiction is trauma, like full stop. And and homelessness is traumatic, and being swept is traumatic. And so absolutely, there are people who had housing and addiction before they became homeless. And there are people who became homeless and then, you know, fell into addiction. That happens as well. And I think that, you know, that no matter what, people deserve dignity. They deserve housing. They need that. And the people that I've met down in the encampment, and yes, I was down there yesterday when it was hot as bulls. And I only had to be there for a few hours, but I was thirsty and I was hot and I was smelly and I was tired and I came home and I just wanted to collapse. But my God, was I lucky to be able to collapse in my own bed, you know, and I recognize that so many people don't have that. And then when I leave them, I worry about them, the friends that I've made down there. And so, you know, and they are like a community to each other. I think that's another part of the trauma is that you're separating people from their community that they're keeping, that keeps them afloat. So if you talk to people down there, they look out for each other. They protect each other. They share what they have with each other. They call each other family, the people in the encampment. And so sweeping them is not just throwing away their property. Sweeping them is often breaking those ties that have kept them alive. And those ties are sometimes all they have in this world. So it's a problem.
That's a big difference, I think, between the encampments that happened last summer and the encampments and other communities living in Kensington. Last summer was an anomaly. It was people coming together with a shared goal of protesting the conditions of homelessness in Philadelphia. And so people were, you know, don't get me wrong, people were looking out for each other, but it lasted for 4 months, right? People in Kensington have been in their chosen communities which protect each other for 3 years, 4 years. You know, they've been there for so long together, and so you separate them and they meet up somewhere else 2 blocks away and they set up their life again, or people get moved and you never see them again. You know, people get, like, for the lack of a better word, disappeared, by the city. And one of the important reasons why people keep their communities together in Kensington, why they look out for each other, is because of these daily sweeps that happen in the mornings. The police come, they wake everybody up, and then they start throwing away any property that people can't protect with their own bodies, right? You can say, this is my property, you can, you know, sit on it, you can try to protect it as much as you can, but if you have a friend who left to go get a drink from the corner store and the police come right as they leave, all their stuff is going to be gone. And so if you're a person alone in Kensington and you leave to go use the bathroom in a shop or something, or you leave to go get a medication or to go to a doctor's appointment, you'll come back and all of your stuff is gone. So that's one of the crucial reasons why community is so necessary in Kensington, is because of these daily sweeps. People, and even, you know, there's people that say, this is my husband's stuff, please don't throw it away. They'll still throw it away, but sometimes they won't. Yeah.
They'll throw away stuff when your stuff is right there. The cops will come and throw it away. And as Megan said, they throw away anything that isn't tied down. If it's not tied down, the cops will throw it out. In front of you, they'll throw out your own things. People have lost their medication, their tents, their clothing, their blankets, their paperwork, their IDs, and any little, what little money they have is taken.
People have lost photos of their family. People have lost ashes of their deceased relatives. You know, anything of sentimental value even. And the city likes to say things like, well, we only destroy things that are a public safety hazard. We only destroy infested clothing or, you know, dirty tents or things like that. And first of all, the issue with that is you're living outside. Things might be a little bit dirty. That doesn't mean it's not still yours and that it's not still valuable to you. I'd rather wear a dirty shirt than no shirt at all. You know, like it's, and the other issue of it is that's completely a lie. Tom lost his barbecue grill that he bought 2 days before because the police took it and said it was a trash treasure and kept it. Like, they lose brand new clothes, they lose brand new blankets, they lose, how can you say that an ID is infested? How can you say that your medication is dirty or infested? It's just a lie. And in the name of public safety, they're taking everything that people have in the world, including things that are uninfested, that are brand new, that are valuable, things that are sentimental value. You can't say that somebody's parents' ashes are infested.
But
I
don't think that it is about public safety at all. Whatever argument they give, it's not about that. In fact, the people who are houseless often are they're more often the victims of abuse than the perpetrators of abuse, and I see that all the time. When people are unhoused, the housed population, they absolutely torment them. People who are living on the streets are often beaten. They have their things stolen, even not by the cops, by the regular public. They're kicked. They have things thrown at them, and it's absolutely devastating. Yeah. But one other thing I want to go back to, and I want to just push back slightly on one thing you said, which is that this comment that the people who are, protesting, or the counter-protesters who want the sweeps, are kind of elitist. And I just want to make clear that that this is, I don't see that as the case all the time. So as I mentioned before, when we went live. Last summer, the encampments were in a very rich section of Philadelphia on the Parkway in Rittenhouse. And I did see those community members who were against the encampment as very elitist. Yeah. Many of them white liberals who, were all about, in theory, helping the poor. But I don't want to see them in my backyard where my child should play softball.
You mean the resistance?
Yes, yeah. That's exactly right. Yes, yeah. Antifa. So this summer, the Kensington encampments are in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and so I want to be clear that a lot of the people who are protesting the encampments, who want the encampments gone, are people in Kensington who themselves are on the verge of homelessness. I don't consider their anger elitist. I think that what we see in this country is like, what is that, crabs in a barrel, and people who are often selling out their own political interests, right, and are missing the point, missing who the real enemy is. And so, as Delaney said, maybe they're angry because we aren't getting any help. We need help to survive, but here we are working day and night in jobs that aren't paying us enough, and there's these homeless people who are going to get housing. And so my response to that is, you should be getting more. We all should be. Like, yes, you are right to be angry that you are not getting the things you need to survive, but your anger is misplaced if you are taking it out on people who are homeless. Instead, take that out on these corporations that aren't paying you enough. Take it out on the system, on the city that is exploiting and gentrifying, right? So
the real estate developers on your city council selling you out.
Right. That's exactly right. And so while I think it's very important that we don't paint paint all people who are homeless with a broad brush, and that we understand that there is incredible diversity of experience in that population. I think it's also true coming from those who are against encampments or who are angry because they have houses and don't want to see homeless people in their houses. I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that, as everything is. And in many ways, I have more compassion for the Kensington neighbors. You know, okay, so on one hand, we could say that they're angry because they have to go out and see this, right? On the other hand, you know, they can't walk on the sidewalk. So where our friends are sleeping is a sidewalk, and there's no other public place to walk. So what I see all the time is people, and sometimes children, who have to walk in traffic because they can't walk on the sidewalk. That is a problem. I wouldn't want my child to have to constantly walk in traffic, right? So the solution is housing. Right. The solution is not, you know, to traumatize the people who are doing what they have no other alternative to do, which is sleep on the
street. Not by choice sleeping on the sidewalk.
Exactly right. So, but there's a variety of reasons that the neighbors might be angry, including, you know, having people sleeping on the street is keeping the value, you know, from increasing. And so if somebody in Kensington wants to sell their house, they're going to think the value of my house is less because of these people out here. They think they could have no animus towards the people on the street, but financially these people on the street are hurting me because my house is my investment, and it's now worth so much less because there's people sleeping here. So there's a variety of reasons. In the end of the day, I think that just be a fucking good person. Like, have some fucking compassion and empathy for people, right? But my empathy also extends to the people in Kensington, not the people in Rittenhouse. I have no empathy for the people in Rittenhouse.
I have no empathy for the developers of Kensington or the city that's complaining, or, you know, wealthy developers are also a demographic that is pushing back against homeless people in Kensington. But something that's so frustrating for me as well is a lot of people are right about a lot of things, and then they're just going about it the wrong way. We see people that are, you know, complaining about homelessness in Kensington, that are saying kick them out, that are saying don't give them any more services, but they're saying that because they believe, and this is true, that the city's budget is being woefully misallocated to shelters, or misallocated to, you know, temporary fixes to homelessness, when and also, you know, the corruption, and people point this out all the time, that the city is giving property to wealthy developers who are on city council, or who are part of the, you know, city's budget, or who are just their friends, and they're creating market rate housing that box out both homeless people in Kensington and residents of, you know, unhoused people of Kensington. And it's so frustrating to see people be on the right track for most of it. They're like, yeah, the city's budget is misallocated. Yeah, we should be focusing on long-term services. But until then, kick everybody out of Kensington. And so what I'm going to do is go protest homeless people in Kensington. You know what I mean? It is the right path. You're on the right path, and then you come to the wrong conclusion.
I want to make one other point, and I know that we've already been talking for like over an hour and a half, so I think maybe, I hope that your listeners haven't tuned us out already. But I do, like, my brain is always like coming back to things that I want to close out. And you mentioned something about Israel-Palestine. Number one, free Palestine. Number two, though, I'm going to make a connection between homelessness here and homelessness there. First of all, I've traveled the entire world. They don't have homelessness to this extent everywhere. So I also have been to Israel many times, and Palestine. There's no homelessness in the West Bank. There is none. There's homelessness in Gaza, and that's because they've been bombed to hell. And so people have no homes because because the houses have been bombed and they can't get supplies to rebuild. In the West Bank, though,
and they're blockaded.
That's exactly right. In the West Bank, though, they have people take care of each other. So you have water rationed in the West Bank, including the fact that, you know, so Mikrot, an Israeli water company that that takes water from Palestine aquifers, sells it back to them at an increased rate, that it sells them much more expensive, their own water, than they sell it to the Israelis or the settlements.
You mean the Nestle of the Middle East?
That's exactly right. And then yes, that's right. And then they put water tanks on top of the Palestinian properties and ration their water. But even if they have rationed water, they are sharing their water and their housing and their food, what limited they have, with other people, family and neighbors. and would not allow people to live and die on the streets. I then, when I was in Palestine last, took a small trip into Jerusalem. It was a long trip because of all the checkpoints I had to pass through, despite the fact that I am Jewish. I went through the checkpoints, and as soon as I got into Israel, there was homelessness everywhere. And to me, that's the lens I look at a place. As a place is only as developed as how you care for your citizens. And if there are people sleeping in the street, that tells me you are underdeveloped. And so that's how I see Israel. And what was interesting is that a couple years ago, I was in a panel here in Philadelphia, and someone from the Office of Homeless Services, one of the executives, was on the panel speaking with me, and he was late to the panel. I think it was David Holloman. Okay. He was late to the panel, and he apologized. He said, "I'm sorry for running late, but I just came from a very important meeting because there were Israeli officials here who were looking through our shelters because they wanted to learn best practices from us in terms of how to deal with their homeless problem in Israel." And I was like, of course. I was like, so basically, one militarized state is telling another militarized state how to criminalize your homelessness. That sounds about right.
United States, Israel has
if I know
so much from the United States, you know what I mean, in terms of militarization, in terms of homelessness, in terms of benefits,
exactly.
it is a mirror of the United States.
Which is why they're an ally. Yeah, but definitely when David was like that, I was like, if I know any of these players, that sounds about right.
Can I just ask a question to wrap up? You know, obviously President Biden's not totally responsible for the corrupt country we live in. He let all homeless in Philadelphia. He led, you know, he was certainly a player in the corruption and is still corrupt. But, you know, we have him saying, oh, you know, get the vaccines. We could be back to normal. Could be with your friends at the 4th of July barbecue. You know, all this fairy tale fantasy stuff. This back to normal, getting, you know, him beating Trump, the resistance. It was all about back to normal, back to brunch. But there's like 11 million people, I think that's an understatement, about to be evicted at the end of this month. There's already, who knows how many people that have illegally been evicted despite a moratorium. People are losing their unemployment prematurely. People have lost their health care. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So from a bigger picture, what does it say that this is back to normal when all this is going on? And frankly, you're probably going to have an explosion on top of an explosion with all additional homeless people.
Yeah. So
this is normal.
It is. But to me, we are coming out of a time of extreme darkness. And I think that we have the flip side of experiencing something so incredibly dark and chaotic and traumatizing, because I think we've all been through a trauma to one level or another. We've all been going through trauma. And I think the flip side of it is that we have this opportunity right now to create a new normal. And I don't think that these opportunities come around very often, but we have it right now, and I don't want us to squander it, which is why I'm enlisting as many people as possible to fight against this normal, to say, this is not okay. We are not going to accept this. We are going to fight for something better. And then get involved and figure out what your role is in the fight, because I think we all have one. And together we will be able to end this, you know, system of inequity that we see all around us. And if we don't, it's going to come back and it's going to bite us in the ass. Because like I said, it's a snake eating its own tail. So we either fix it or we will eventually be eaten by it.
Do you need additional legal support from
from lawyer that wants to work with us? Hit us up, email me, please. It is so hard, and that's something. I mean, like Stephanie will agree with me, but as the person that, not bragging, but like as the person that wrote all of the documents for the filing last summer, for the filing this summer, I've said this to you before. God, I wish I had more guidance, right? I wish I had a lawyer that was, and Mike Huff is amazing, right? But he's a litigator. He goes into court and he argues the hell out of the case, but he's busy as hell. So I'm writing everything by myself, and I would do such a better job if we had other lawyers. I just finished my second year in law school, and Oh, no, it's not your fault. It's the fault of this city contracting everybody to hell, and like and also just people's apathy and lawyers being overworked and apathy, and it's just like, any lawyer that wants to help us, you know, we have this injunction happening, but we also are planning, like we said before, a substantive lawsuit about the state-created danger of pushing people into to the shelter system and of, you know, sweeps of homeless people in general. We're helping prepare a case against some of the shelters for abuses of staff and people in the shelters, of inhumane conditions in the shelters. So, and also, you know, we try to help people on the streets as much as we can find legal representation. So any type of lawyer is helpful. A benefits lawyer, an employment lawyer, a dog bite lawyer, anybody. You know what I mean? I have people constantly asking me, can you find me a lawyer for this and that and the third? And I try, but I'm 22. And I'm by myself. Like, I would love to have as much help as possible. So if you're watching this and you're a lawyer, hit me up.
And if you want, if you want to give out, how do people contact you if they want to help?
Yeah, we can share our email addresses. Is that okay? So mine is stephanie.senna@law.villanova.edu.
We'll put it in the description.
Okay, perfect. Delaney, I don't know, and you don't have to give
I am
yours.
DKEEFE3@law.villanova.edu. Please send me an email. I would love to hear from anybody. And I'm also wondering, before we wrap up, do you have any other like substantive legal questions about the injunction or about other legal stuff? Because I would love to answer them.
Great.
Questions were awesome, but I feel like we talked about policy so much, and I'm sorry if I derailed things.
No, totally. Yeah, I guess we could go in one different direction. You know, to me, part of the issue, and you touched on this too, is judges are not exactly the most, shall we say. I mean, here's an example. John, our photojournalist behind the camera, he was down in North Carolina covering the Andrew Brown murder and the protests. And I didn't know it at the time, but the judge who ruled that they would not release the body camera footage to the public, and, you know, what they did release to the family wasn't the full thing. Well, tweets came out, other things came out that he's a raging Republican and, you know, big Trumper. So whether it's political ideology, whether it's judges up for election, those kind of things, we have a corrupt political system, but, you know, there's some problems with judges. So can you kind of describe those issues?
I'm pulling the statistic out of my ass right now, but isn't it like the majority of federal judges now are Trump appointees because he did a mass sweeping appointment of tons of federal judges? And I think the judge that we had last was...
No, he was a Reagan appointee.
Oh, Reagan. Yeah. But, I mean, you know, still. Judges are massively Republican, and to say that the legal system is nonpartisan, to say that judges are arbiters of justice regardless of their political affiliation is a lie. Yeah. The legal system is inherently conservative, and so judges in general are inherently conservative. The law is conservative because of precedent, because of the United States is one of the only countries in the world that uses precedent, which basically means that if something has happened in the past in a court that is higher than you have to follow it. Yeah. You cannot change your mind. You cannot implement reforms. You are bound to the things that happened 100 years ago. And
unless it's the 2000 election and the Supreme Court steals it for George W. Bush.
Right. Then do whatever the fuck you want. The Supreme Court can do whatever the fuck they want, and that's why it's so important for conservative presidents to appoint as many justices. That's why it's so important to pack the courts, is because the Supreme Court is the only court that is not bound by precedent. So you put a bunch of Republicans on the Supreme Court, they create precedent for the rest of the entire country, and then they're bound to follow it. The only way to create progress really in the legal system is to disagree with precedent, which is not allowed, or to take things to the Supreme Court, which is majority Republican.
There's two other things that I want to mention happening. There's a lot of judges who aren't educated, aren't well educated about the issues. I met a judge recently in Philadelphia who was a judge in drug court, and her job was to determine if people are incarcerated and for how long their sentence should be. And so I started asking her some very basic questions about, like, mass incarceration. Have you ever heard of the new Jim Crow? Do you know Michelle Alexander? Have you heard of Brian Stevenson? Like, do you know about any of the writings? Have you seen the documentary 13th? Like, do you know anything about, statistics when it comes to, incarceration and black men? Like, do you know? And she had not only no concept of any of it, had never heard any of these names. Like, I imagine if I say these names to you, you're recognizing some of them. And so, and it wasn't even just that she even had an opinion, she had just never heard of this, of any of these arguments before. And then I met recently a judge who was a judge in eviction court, and he didn't know about tenant rights. And so for the judge in the eviction court, like, in essence, he has... he's overwhelmed and, you know, under-resourced himself, actually, and so has all of these cases. And what he has is the vast majority of landlords have lawyers with them, and the tenants don't. And so for the judge, his incentive is actually, I got to, you know, make these cases move through the system, and I need to do that as fast as possible. And so the easiest way to do that is to agree with the dude with the lawyer, like that, you know. And often, if the tenants don't really know the laws, and the judge doesn't know the law, and they have no lawyer to, you know, so there's a lot of judges in these different courts, not just federal court, right, that are also themselves holding up corrupt systems, and so many of them are uneducated about these issues, and it's not even in their interest to be educated. If they were actually educated, they would realize that their life's work is really, you know, problematic. And I think to that extent, so many of us just do these jobs that uphold corrupt systems, and we intentionally don't learn about how they do it. We just think we're doing our job well or as good as we can, but we don't actually ask the questions, is this job creating a better world? Like, is the work that I'm doing furthering equity and you know, increasing justice and liberty, or not? And I think a lot of it is not.
And a lot of lawyers would tell you that that is not the job of the courts. Yeah. And that actually it is destructive to the rule of law to try and implement equity, to try and create change. And to be a judge is not to be an expert in the policy surrounding the law that you're implementing. It's to be an expert in the Pennsylvania Code and the federal rules of civil procedure. It's to be an expert in the past, basically. Being an expert in the future or even the present is not a part of the job.
Well,
and
today it's not a part of the
job.
Yeah. I don't think that's always how the court ruled.
And we have movements, and this is why movement lawyering is so incremental as well, is because, first of all, everything is very conservative. They try to do the things that they did before, but you get waves of reforms, and usually it comes from the Supreme Court, because they're the only ones that are allowed to make reforms. But this is slightly off topic, but we were talking about movement lawyering. You know, it all has to be incremental because of the lack of knowledge in the courts about what's actually going on. You think about, I'm going to butcher this, my law professors are going to be so mad, but you think about Brown versus Board of Education, desegregating public, you know, elementary and yeah, that was the Warren Court. That was a very progressive court. That was a rarity at the time, but also Brown versus Board of Education didn't just happen. You know, it started with desegregating public law schools, and then it started with and then it continued to desegregating public universities as a whole, and then we went into elementary schools and middle schools. But it's all incremental because you have to teach people along the way. It's stupid how you have to teach people along the way, but
that's why I always say education is crucial. Yeah. And none of us are getting a good education. I don't care how resourced your school was. I went to a very resourced school, a public school that had a lot of, you know, of money because of the tax base, and yet I didn't learn shit, which is why I assign a book to my students called The Lies My Teacher Told Me. My professor in college, Charlie Hardy, who I adore, assigned it to me, and I assigned it to my students. And so I think that absolutely we need a re-education, and so that is in the classroom. It is, but it's also with the press, and so you are doing that work, and you're doing the Lord's work. Yeah. So thank you so much for that.
It's not just me. Jen, John, photojournalist. We got Colin in Texas, our editor, graphic designer. We now have an intern. So thank you guys for taking the time. We should say tomorrow, possibly other days this week, certain locations are facing sweeps, which is evictions. So we'll be covering that tomorrow. We don't know what time. Police tend to do it at unpredictable times. So we might go live early in the morning tomorrow. We might not. It just depends what happens. But we'll still be here tomorrow. Definitely, if you missed any of the interviews, I really hope you'll cover it. You will watch them. My interview with Veronica, who was with Club Sandwich, that was yesterday. Club Sandwich hands out food and other things to the vulnerable here, and I'm already stealing her fabulous line that the Republican Party is a horror show and the Democratic Party is a fantasy, because it's the best description I've ever heard of the two-party duopoly. We also posted earlier this morning a really, infuriating but powerful interview with Kazim Griffin, who was a construction worker who was evicted during the pandemic and has been sleeping in the park, McPherson Square, with other houseless people. He's been sleeping there for over a year. His mother just died 4 days ago. He couldn't go to the funeral. He can't get back to construction jobs because kind of need a address on your resume. So that's up. And, humbly, CNN's not speaking with him. We are. We got some other things lined up. Going to go to Ohio. I don't want to announce anything, but I think you'll like what we're doing there. Pretty big interview lined up. Speak with other folks involved with pending evictions, unemployment, loss of unemployment, houselessness, you name it. We'd like to dip into West Virginia, but I'm just going to be honest. This is all very expensive. Food, gas, the hotel. We need extra equipment. The parking in Philadelphia. We've already spent, I think $100 in less than a day on parking, which is a complete scam, not just here, but pretty much every gentrified city. It's very expensive. Obviously, tough times for a lot of people. So if you can't support us, no problem. Share the content, like the content, post it on your social media. We are being suppressed. But if you can support us, statuscoup.com/theotherpandemic. Statuscoup.com/theotherpandemic. Do I have that right, Jen? And, I will say this, and not even humbly, reality. There's a lot of independent outlets out there asking you for money. Are they here? Seriously. Are they here? Are they taking reporting road trips? Unicorn Riot, who I agree does great work. There's very few. Very few. And by the way, we're not dining at the Ritz-Carlton. We're not staying at the Four Seasons. So if you can, we've already had so many generous people yesterday, some more today supporting us. We need a lot more because honestly, our map is based on the gas in our car, how much money we could have for hotels, all that. The other thing I'll say is, we're kind of walking and chewing gum at the same time. If you're not aware, we just launched a Substack, like the rest of the cool kids, to have a written component here. So this morning, we broke a story. We obtained audio from a February 2020 West Virginia Democratic State Party meeting. You might ask, Jordan, who the hell cares about the West Virginia Democratic State Party meeting? Well, if you followed our Substack last week, we broke news that the West Virginia State Democratic Party, which, by the way, is essentially run by Senator Joe Manchin, who's been in the news lately. They don't go to the bathroom without his permission. He's involved with most things in the state party. The West Virginia State Party kind of hasn't followed the DNC's bylaws from 1974, saying you must create an affirmative action plan and committee. They just formed it 47 years later and held a meeting. This was in the story last week, to vote on the affirmative action plan. But the white chairwoman attempted to block the affirmative action committee from entering the meeting to vote for it. So that was last week. And I watched the whole meeting, 2 hours, so you didn't have to. We did put the video of the meeting in the story. We spoke with some of the folks involved who were blocked out. But today, we found out in audio from before the pandemic, February 2020, essentially this same chairwoman, in a very slapdash manner, abruptly, without notice to the state executive committee, she basically introduced 5 females to become executive committee members, didn't give the required notice that there would be an election in the executive committee meeting, so other women could not like run or campaign because they didn't know about it. And 3 out of the 5 women were black women. They had no voting power on the executive committee. Her quote was, "This doesn't dilute your votes. You take the word dilute how you want to." It might sound kind of wonky. Read the story, please. You could sign up. You could sign up for free at our Substack, statuscoup.substack.com, statuscoup.substack.com. You could also sign up as a paid member for $5 a month. $5 a month. If you can't sign up paid, you can sign up free. There's nothing stopping you. Statuscoup.substack.com. We're doing a mix of investigative stuff, some commentary. We will have a few dispatches from the road. What am I looking at? Oh, okay. Bear with me. I'll be quick. $5. Gigo Lobro 09 from King of Prussia. The suburbs and the prices are going up. Duly noted. $20. Super chat. Quote, "What about organizations like Habitat for Humanity, state and federal funding, and designate a part of federal land to build homes? I heard it's cheaper to give the homeless homes than what they spend on policing and law." Sure. I completely agree. Nicole Vance, $5 to the super chat. Thank you. Andy C, €5 super chat. Greetings from Ireland and super respect for all the work you and Status Coup team do. Jordan, to help give a voice to the forgotten in society. Thank you. Wish I could have a Guinness with you. Carrie, $20 in a super chat. Agreed, our society is back-assed backwards. Should be non-such thing as a billionaire. That only means average American citizens are being overtaxed. Gene, $4.99 in the super chat. Thanks for covering this. Carrie, $30. Thank you so much. Senior affordable housing is also needed. Paying out $1,800 a month for a non-assisted living apartment is ridiculous for average seniors to afford. Agreed. Bernie was pretty much the only one talking about senior care. Eugene Debs, $4.99 in the super chat. Keep fighting for the voiceless. We shall. Das Bosch Fleisch donated 21 euros. I can't give dollars, but hope euros will do. God bless you. Okay, those are for... Oh, there's a GoFundMe tab. Hold on.
Are these people who are commenting or responding to the video?
Yeah. Oh, I can't believe real life Eugene Debs watched our video. Passing the dead. Thank you.
Thank you, Anonymous. $10. Thank you, Anonymous. $10. Thank you, another Anonymous. $100. They're not real estate developers, I can promise you. Donna, $10. Tom, $50. Anonymous, $20. Anonymous, $10. Daniel, $10. Thank you guys so much. I'm tech challenged and just signed out of it. If you can sign me back in. The what tab? I'm very tech challenged.
Oh, I moved it. Hold on.
It wasn't me.
No, it indeed was not this time. This one.
What is a POWR?
We pay for it every month for fundraising.
Oh, okay. $20. Annette. Thank you so much, Annette. Thank you, Brian from Cleveland, where we're going. $50. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, Dave McKendrick, $5. Thank you, June Henry, $25. Thank you, Samuel Levin, $20. Thank you, Mildred Campana, $100. Thank you so much. Literally, when celebrities say we can't do this without our fans, this and that, whatever. We literally cannot do this. Literally cannot do this. Cannot fund this without you. Unicorn Riot, you mentioned, did amazing work on the ground with the initial George Floyd protests. And because of that great work, what did they get, like $1 million in donations or something like that in a very short time? So, they'd been pounding the pavement for years, scratching quarters together like we are. And then they kind of hit it big with that great coverage. So we're still kind of, pre that. We hope one story kind of hits. We do have a Mega Flint cover-up story coming out, so stay tuned. But we appreciate your donations. If you can't donate but know a friend who might like the content, wants to support it, spread the coup, spread the word. Makes a big difference. So, text message. Sign up for our text message system. How do you sign up? Statuscoup.com/text. We moved away from this corporate vulture company that was charging us an arm and a leg to send out text messages when we're live. We're now with a new company that's charging us slightly less than an arm and a leg, more like a toe and a leg. I don't know. But statuscoup.com/text, so you can get a text message when we're live. That's very important. We're not texting you when, like, we go to the bathroom or spamming you. Just when we're live. Just when we're live, because YouTube notifications, don't get me started on our email chain with YouTube, are kind of a 50-50 proposition, probably a 30-70 proposition. You might get a notification a year after we're live, but a text you'll get relatively soon after we go live. So many people say, I just got the text. That's the only way I knew about this. That's part of the digital suppression I was talking about. So please sign up for our text list, statuscoup.com/text. And tomorrow morning, again, really have to just see what conditions on the ground are. There's likely going to be sweeps in a certain area in Kensington, which is very poor. So we're going to be out there early morning. Don't know if we'll be live, but definitely we'll get the footage if we're not live, and we'll go from there. Thank you for watching. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Delaney. I'll put their emails in the description under the video if you didn't catch it, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.